Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the very first webinar in this particular series, titled Leadership Conversations on COVID-19 and the Public Trust. My name is Michael DeWilde. I'm the director of the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative at Seidman College of Business. And joining me today are Dr. Paul Isley, the Associate Dean at Seidman, an environmental economist, among other things, and Professor Dan Giedeman, also a professor of economics, specialized in international economics. We're going to be looking at higher education, how those institutions are responding and what they might look like going forward. Thank you all for joining us. Before we do look ahead in any sense, we're here to talk about the economy and ethics and the public interest. It's right now, people are handing about the term Great Depression, or we haven't seen anything like some of these numbers since the Great Depression. Can we get your take on what you see? Dan, I'll start.
Okay, yeah, certainly what we are seeing in terms of the decline in employment, certainly there's going to be an increase in unemployment rates. I mean, this is unprecedented. I mean, even if you would go back to the beginning of the Great Depression, you will not have seen the drop in the labor market like what we're seeing right now. The report came out today about GDP in the first quarter, and it was lower than what people expected. It doesn't seem like, it was minus 4.8%. That's started about 1/8 to 1/9, 1/10 of what goes into that. So the actual decrease is a fair bit worse. In terms of a depression, I would certainly not go that far yet. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the future? But the reason the Great Depression was a Great Depression was not just the severity, but it was the length. I mean, and so you were looking at almost a decade-long large decrease in economic activity. Even some of the most gloomy of the reports I've seen suggest that, we're looking at a multi-year thing here, but not a decade before recovery. So I'd say we're in a pretty severe recession, probably an unprecedented type of recession that we're in, but I wouldn't use the word Great Depression for this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. What we have here is unprecedented speed with which the economy has slowed down. We haven't seen anything like this, where essentially 40 to 50% of the economy is stopped in a matter of 2 weeks. That hasn't happened before. So we have very little to tell us how it's going to behave as we continue to move on. But what we're seeing right now is April's going to be really, really bad. May's going to be bad because the data we're going to be getting in May is from April. But almost all of the models that are out there, and again, this is different than anything that we've ever modeled before, shows us returning to what would be considered a much more normal as we started getting into summer. So that's what we're looking at right now. We're still looking at probably 20 to 25% unemployment in Michigan. Difference as to how this plays out.
Thanks, Paul. That makes me want to jump in on a related on who's ultimately responsible. Should the federal government, quote, be bailing out states that are, quote, mismanaged? You have Governor Cuomo. What kinds of relief efforts and who's responsible for those make the most sense to you as an economist?
I can start with that real quickly. One of the things that concerns me a little bit is when we start to get the states kind of playing against one another, is kind of the heart about what the United States is. And so we can compare it a little bit to the European Union. So the European Union, it's a bunch of separate sovereign nations, and they generally don't transfer resources between them. The United States has always had what we could refer to as a fiscal union. And so tax money gets paid in and it gets distributed across states. And yeah, some states receive more than others. Some states pay more than others. And that's part of what makes it a country. And so when I start to see, certain leaders from certain states say, well, we're not going to support these other states, and then other states saying, well, we've always supported you, that worries me, not necessarily from an economic point of view, but more from a political point of view, is that, what has made us, what has made us as a country has been this idea that, not regionalism, but it's more of a, hey, we're all Americans in a way, and we're going to help people out. If there's a hurricane in Florida, the aid's going to go there. Something else happens here and there. And so now the idea that you're going to start to throw accusations back and forth at different states of, well, you're a taker, no, you're a taker, that worries me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, from an economic point of view, the real issue is state policies allow for variation when variation is useful. It allows for experimentation when experimentation is useful. But it doesn't allow for coordination, and you need the federal government to do that coordination. So if we think about trying to restart our supply chain in the United States, that's going to be very complicated, and it crosses many states. So having some federal do that would allow that to happen smoother and would allow us to get out of this faster. And so it's important to have that. And in addition, different places are going to be affected differently, and they're going to need support. The states don't have deep enough pockets to handle what we're seeing right now. You need the federal government to be able to come in to help shave off the bottom so that we don't go, and that allows us to come back faster on the other side.
And what kind of marks would, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say, I mean, many states have in their state constitutions, they have balanced budget constraints, which basically means, you know, if all of a sudden tax revenue goes down, they have to slash spending, whereas the federal government does that. The federal government can borrow money. And so if it's going to borrow money and then help out the states, I mean, that's one of the things that the federal government, I think that's actually a pretty useful tool for governments to have.
And maybe you can help me, and perhaps there are others with this question out there as well. As I've been reading this, I'm not an economist. The 90% rule in terms of borrowing against GDP is one that I've been reading about a lot. We're close, but still trillions of dollars away from it. As you look at, Paul, you mentioned 20-25% employment, and it's going on for years. Are we continuing to borrow trillions of dollars into the next couple of years, do you think? And if so, is that the necessary remedy?
Well, we know that you can get an economic pump in the short run by borrowing against the future. So really what you're doing is you're taking some value from the future and you're borrowing it, and you're using the hole a little bit so that it's not as deep. So that doesn't work forever. So I would expect that the deficits that we're seeing, this is going to be the big pump in that. But likely we'll continue to see deficit spending. The key, as it is with an individual, is depends on what you spend that money on. If it's an investment, making things better for the future, that is much better than debt that's just extending consumption. So as we look at what's happening right now, we're investing in keeping the U.S. economy afloat so that we have a ship to save as the corporate side of America starts to come back online.
Yeah, I'll agree with Paul there. I think this is not the time to be worrying about the deficit. It's not the time to be worrying about government debt. I mean, you know, it's a lifesaver. It's a life preserver that we're basing. We want to keep people engaged in the economy. We want to keep workers there, so when things do start to come back, they're able to go back to their jobs. And so different support programs we can put into place. You know, as Paul said, he used the word investment, and we wouldn't think about that. You say we're borrowing, but it's not really borrowing. It's what we're spending the money on. The 90% ratio, part of that came out of a research paper that was kind of poorly designed. It basically showed that when nation deficit levels get too big, there's an economic downturn, but the causality was basically backwards. What happens when you have an economic downturn? That's when deficits get bigger. And so that's where that research got a lot of play in the press, but it wasn't the best research. The main thing is, do people believe that the United States government is going to be able to make its debt payments? And as long as people think the U.S. government is going to be able to make its debt payments, they're going to be willing to lend money to it. I mean, look at the interest rates right now the U.S. government's able to borrow money at. They're incredibly low, which basically means everybody around the world is saying, who's the most, trustworthy, who's the safest borrower to lend money to? It's the U.S. government. And so the markets, the people around the world who have this money are saying, we trust that the U.S. government is going to be okay with this. And so, yeah, it's, I don't want to have huge budget deficits. I don't want to have huge government debt, but it's not unreasonable to have it at this time.
So let me follow up on the notion of investment then. It's interesting to put it that way, that this isn't just a life raft or just a survival line, that it's something we could be thinking about as an investment towards a future that builds towards something. So let me go really big picture. is this an opportunity? And the most overused phrase since this pandemic started, in my opinion, is, a crisis gives us opportunity. But it's true, right? There are opportunities here. So what opportunities do you see? I mean, I'm reading everything. This is a chance to go close to carbon neutral for our economy. This is a chance to rethink distribution and wage restructuring. This is a chance to rethink all kinds of things. So, what stood out to you as the greatest opportunity here in the crisis? Dan, you want to go? You want to take that?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, one of the things I think we're seeing is the connection between sort of public health and the economy. There's, some people kind of phrase it differently. It's almost like they're opposing, okay, we need to support the economy and let the health take care of itself, or we need to worry about health and not worry about the economy. But most economists, the vast majority of economists, think these things go hand in hand. And so I think that would be one of the places I'd look to see. Is there an opportunity to figure out how can we use the economy to support public health? Is there a way that we can make sure that, people, if they're sick, they don't feel compelled to go into work? Is it a way that if they feel sick, they know they can go to the doctor and not incur huge costs by it? And so I think that's going to be where some of the issues come out. For some of the other things like carbon neutral, moving there, I don't see that making a big change. In terms of distribution, people are talking about it. If you look at the politics though, I'm not sure what's going to happen. So I'm skeptical might be too harsh of the word, but I'm not optimistic. If you want to move in that direction, I would not be optimistic that there's going to be huge societal changes that will come out of this, even if we might find some desirable.
I have to agree with that, because I think the one place where people are going to have this discussion at a deeper level is going to be healthcare. And certainly that healthcare insecurity has been a big issue here in the United States, and it's been a big problem, particularly for being able to crawl up the ladder of into middle class and beyond, is that fear of health insecurity. But as we look at other things like carbon neutrality, people are very optimistic because they see substantial decreases in pollution right now. They see substantial decreases in the amount of fossil fuels being used. The cutback has been enough that Germany essentially has been running on renewable resources for a few days. That's a short-term effect, most likely, because we don't have the infrastructure to maintain that as the economy comes back. The cost is too high to gain that level of environmental benefit. And it's actually going to cause a problem for us because it's taking away that investment money that we could do to move towards a more sustainable society. So businesses aren't going to spend money on things that make processes more efficient, or replacing their fuel sources, or thinking about how do we bridge societal issues if they're worried about making payroll next week because they don't have the funds available. And so I think it will actually slow down a lot of those things as we come out of this.
Well, that makes me want to follow up in a number of ways. So I guess the first question is, since you both mentioned it, are you both advocating for, either as personally and professionally, something like universal health care as a way to address crises like this in the future?
Well, you know, those words have lots of political impact in them.
I know.
But, and I know that that's what you want. What I can say are the two best studies that I've seen, one out of University of Oregon, one out of University of Michigan, which looks at the effects of expanding Medicaid when we did that 5 years ago now. What they found was that that didn't result in a substantial benefit to people's health, but it did do a substantial benefit to their social well-being and their willingness to take risks in order to move up the economic ladder. So if we want to have a society where someone working hard can get ahead and move up the ladder, we have to find a way that individuals have access to health care even when that may not be attached to their employment.
I agree with Paul there. And universal healthcare could be, is it going to be a single payer, or is it could be just some sort of mandate where everybody has to have insurance? And so you could look at like the UK or Canadian systems and contrast them with, say, a German or Swiss system. The former both have, single payer. The latter have still private insurance companies, but it's mandated. And I think, as Paul said, the idea that we don't necessarily tie healthcare to employment could be pretty important. I mean, think about many people who might have ideas for a business or something like that. We go back to the 1990s. You had the classic Jerry Maguire movie, when he wants to leave, he wants to start his own sports agency. And Renee Zellweger says, well, you have insurance, and that's the big question is, will you be able to start on your own if you don't think you're going to have insurance? And that could actually, in terms of entrepreneurial spirit, you remove, that's a binding constraint for many people. So if you think about it from the business point of view, allowing for universal health care could help there. And then as Paul said, just as a matter of societal well-being, knowing you can go to the doctor, knowing that you're not going to incur huge debts for medical reasons. Just makes life easier. It just reduces the uncertainty that many people face. And I don't think, I think personally, so this is, part of it is professional, but part of it is just personally, my own opinion is, that would make life a lot better for a lot of people. Now, will some people pay higher taxes? Will some people pay more? Yeah, I don't see any way that that's not going to happen. But as a society, would I be willing to pay more? Yes. Will everybody know? And so that's where you get into the big kind of debate about it.
Because it will be an income shift, and that income shift will mean that there are winners and losers on that battle. But it's important to think through how you want to pay for these things. There is no universal, there is no healthcare system which is more universal than what we have in the United States that doesn't fund that partially through helping decide what the best types of remedies are and who should get those. That's part of the question that you have to answer as a society. Are we willing to pay double what everybody else pays in order to have choices when we want them? Or is that cost too high that we will allow some places where things don't make sense that we won't spend money on?
Thank you. Dan, maybe I'll follow up with you on this, and Paul asked you when, of course, as well, and that is, how would you compare and contrast our response to this with some of the other countries around the world? And not from an epidemiological point of view, of course, but in terms of what the relief bills, economic structure. One of the other ways to frame this question is, does this particular crisis highlight already existing and exacerbate those existing inequalities or inequities in our system, or is this sui generis? Has it brought something to the fore that we just haven't seen before in terms of economic meltdown?
Yeah. I'll say a couple things. We could separate a little bit out monetary policy, which is conducted by the Federal Reserve, and fiscal policy, which is conducted by the federal government, and they're not the same. I think the monetary policy has been really, really good. Jerome Powell, who's the current chair of the Fed, they learned a lot from the financial crisis. And they've been very proactive in trying to make sure that there would be money available for businesses to borrow, so that businesses aren't failing, so they have access to various types of markets. And so with respect to monetary policy, I think the United States the Federal Reserve has done a really good job. I also think that in terms of the fiscal response, it's been okay. We just passed sort of the fourth round of fiscal stimulus. The money has been sent out. There might be some concerns about, who's getting the money and who's not getting the money. But overall, I think that $1,200 payment that was sent to individuals, that was good. I don't think that's going to be enough, though. I think we're going to have to do more because I'm a little bit, Paul's a little bit more optimistic often than I am. I'm a little bit more pessimistic, and I'm not certain that I'm very skeptical that we're going to be recovering anytime in the next few months. Some things are going to start to come back online, but I'm worried. And so I think we're going to have to have more payments directly to individuals, directly to households, and also the ability of small business to be able to obtain some sort of funding. So overall, I mean, if I'm going to give it a grade, we just turned in grades. If I would give it a grade, I'd say we're probably in the B+ range for fiscal policy. I mean, not excellent. There's things they could have done better, but so far things have been all right. Now, will it continue? That's where I have my concerns. We're already starting to see, the concerns. Okay, we need to start worrying about the budget. We need to start worrying about, making sure that people don't have misincentives to not go back to work. And so there's going to be some pushback on providing more aid to people. And that's where I start to have a little bit of concerns. And that was the same thing that happened during the Great Recession with the financial crisis. We had a pretty big stimulus package that went through early on, but then not much of anything after that. The Federal Reserve was still pretty active, but the federal government basically didn't do much. And if you look at our recovery, if you look at it, the recovery lagged in no small part because the government kind of wasn't pulling its weight in helping the recovery out. And I have a pretty strong concern that we're going to make that same mistake.
Paul? Sorry. Paul, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say that Americans, by and large, distrust their Federal Reserve for some reason when surveys are done, mostly because they probably don't understand it. But we know the rest of the world saves their money here because they trust the U.S. Federal Reserve more than any other place in the world. And they've been making some really good moves, and those moves have made the impact of this less than it would have been otherwise. So that's really important that we keep our eye on. And although economists worry about debt, and we worry particularly about systemic debt, if you question 100 economists and grabbed 100 people off the streets, economists would be far less worried about debt, because we're a country that's going to continue to grow, and we're going to be able to have ways to pay this debt in the future. We just have to be wise about how we do it. And finally, we're spending trillions of dollars really, really fast. Some of it's going to go to people who shouldn't. Some of it's not going to go to people who should. But in this particular case, it was more important to do it fast than to make sure that you got all those little holes filled correctly. We'll go back and fix that as we go forward in the next set.
Interesting. Do you see structural changes coming out of this? And one of the ones I have in mind, there was an article by Scheidel not too long ago. He said the wealthy should fear pandemics the most, and historically have, because going back to the plague, it really puts the kibosh on labor for two reasons. Either laborers don't survive because they're the most vulnerable, or those who do survive can then demand wage increases that are really sort of change the balance of power in some ways in any particular culture, society, community. Coming out of this, and we've seen a number of instances where people have refused to go back to work, people are demanding more pay, people are trying to unionize, et cetera. There's a nascent, if not coordinated, workers moving around some of this. Do you see any lasting changes coming out of that, at least potential?
Well, I'm going to take one stab at this because I think I'm Dan, who's much more of a historian than I am, is probably going to have a deeper answer. But I think that this is a big shock to the system. And when you have big shocks to the system, you're going to have movements in wealth. You're going to have movements in income. And if you're sitting at the top of the pile, the only way you're going to be able to go is lose something. So yes, there's going to be concern from the most wealthy about that. But even though this is going to benefit those who are able to adjust to workers' fears, it's going to be able to benefit those who adjust to the new needs of consumers, and it's going to benefit those who are responsive to those. And companies and individuals who do those things are going to end up benefiting before this is all said and done.
I'm not certain that, I mean, so if we go back to say, you know, the Black Death, I mean, that caused societal changes, and, you know, if you live through it, generally things were okay for you, again, because there was so much less supply of labor that you could demand higher wages. I don't, you know, I certainly hope we don't reach a stage with this pandemic that it's a decrease in the labor supply is going to help out workers that much. So I don't know. I don't really know if there's going to be huge distributional changes in terms of benefiting workers. That might be the thing I have. I'm not certain of that. I do think there could be some structural changes. I mean, so if you look at right now, we're hosting this webinar over Zoom. And so a lot of people are working from home. And so a question, will we need to go back? Will we be able to work at home? That will cause some changes. Will we need to be living in big cities, or will people in other areas be able to not have to move to the city to be able to enjoy the benefits? Another possibility, though, is that, you know, if we can conduct things by Zoom, well, does that open up the opportunity for people, workers around the world, to now do tasks for American companies? And so we often think about, you know, offshoring. Okay, we're going to send production somewhere else, but it's harder to ship services there. But now if we can start to do stuff via Zoom, well, okay, we just set a timer and I'm going to be chatting with somebody in India, you know, 9 o'clock their time at night, 9 o'clock my time in the morning, however the time zones work. And maybe they could do something. And so that would be some structural change that we might have to see how that would play out as well. So I think there will be changes, but I don't know how to predict what's going to happen. I think things are so much up in the air. I wish I could have something really certain that I could say. I would be fairly confident saying that I don't think that things are going to get a whole lot better. I don't think workers are going to suddenly rise up and be able to do a whole lot of stuff. Now, maybe they'll get more sympathy across the population, where people say, wait a minute, you know, they're the ones who are sacrificing. They're the ones who are going into work, and the rest of us are, you know, safely ensconced in our homes, you know, still getting paid, working from home. I don't know. I don't know if that's going to happen.
Well, and a lot of those workers are doing transactions. They're there to stock a shelf, yes, but they're doing a transaction. And one of the processes that was already happening in the United States, and we knew would be accelerated with the next recession, was transactional workers, somebody who moves a transaction from point A to point B, were going to be under pressure from automation, from AI, from blockchain, from an entire set of technologies that we've been playing with for the last 5 years. This, I think, will accelerate that. And those transactional jobs are often the lowest rung on the ladder as you try and walk up the economic ladder for a lot of people. So I think that in and of itself is going to be a problem for people trying to move up the ladder right now.
So let me press on that a little bit too. And again, whether you want to speak to it from a more distant, sort of distance academic point of view, or your own personal proclivities and inclinations, you know, there was a little bit of traction in the Democratic primaries around the notion of a universal basic guaranteed income and other kinds of protections. And, you know, whether Yang's proposal or the way that Sanders has pulled the Democrats a little bit more to the left or socially progressive, would that have, in your view, economic consequences, negative, positive, helpful? I mean, should we be, and Dan, I'm thinking of you as well, that you know, the kinds of social safety nets that you see in at least parts of Northern Europe and Scandinavia, you know, given what Paul just said, does it just make sense to begin to develop more of that again in this country?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea of having broad social safety nets, helping people out. You know, giving people, relieving them of that concern that if something happens, they're going to be left on their own. I think it's interesting. The United States political system is kind of interesting. So if you look at Scandinavia, for example, people there historically have been much more willing to help out each other because they don't view people as taking advantage of the situation. And I think in the United States, there is much more of a concern among many people that there are going to be people out there who are just going to take advantage of things. And I think that's one of the things that has limited our political desire to put a social safety net in place. Is people say, wait a minute, if we put that in place, we put universal income in place, people are just going to sit at home. They're not even going to try to work. And so why should my hard-earned tax money go to help out people who aren't going to try? And you don't see that as much in Europe, although you have started to see more of that as you've had more immigration come into Europe. And so, broadly, I think it's there. I mean, broadly, I would support it. But politically, again, it's one of these things where you look at the politics, and I'm just not sure that it's going to happen. It's easy to rail on people and kind of point fingers at people. I mean, you look at what's happened with the pandemic, and everybody's pointing fingers. Whose fault is it? Who's caused this? And I think the same thing would happen is if who's not pulling their weight in the economy. And if politically we don't have a societal will to say, wait a minute, we think people are trying to contribute, well, then we're going to be much less willing to help them out. So that's certainly a personal opinion, although there is some research to back that up.
Yeah. Just to pull at the string of universal income just a little bit, the studies on this are small and varied, but the bottom line is universal income on a major scale. We haven't developed the economy to a point where we can afford it yet. That the universal income that you hear about in some countries really isn't universal. It is, it's a support if something goes wrong. And so we need to be careful about how the word is used. And certainly there's a concern about how that creates an incentive to work on the bottom end. But there hasn't been enough of a study yet and a long enough term of a study to really prove one way or the other. And economists worry more about the data than they do about the theory behind the data, which is different than economists were 30 years ago. So.
Good, thanks. Let me shift it to a couple of other things before we open up to questions. One, we're hearing some rhetoric from both the business community and the administration that one of the things that should come out of this is onshoring more of our operations again, that we should bring back more manufacturing, we should have greater capacity to, whether it's this or consequences of climate change or whatever it might be, that we need more, we should re-examine the global distribution chain. Is that something you're looking at as well? And if so, thoughts on that?
Yes, but not the way they want it. So as I've interacted with firms who are having to worry about the supply chain issue, they're worried about supply chain risk. And certainly the length of your supply chain is a risk, but also the number of sources that you have is a risk. You're more efficient by having one supplier, but if something goes wrong in that one location, you have a problem. So what we're hearing more of is more exploration of how they can diversify. So yes, you might have a source here, but then you need a source someplace else and a source someplace else so that you can be prepared to have something running and providing a supply to your business when the problem exists. So I think in the end, will there be some onshoring? There will be of a few critical components, but more likely what you're going to see is the supply chain spread out a little bit and be less dense in some locations so that they're more prepared for whatever types of issues start to show
up. That seems reasonable to me. So,
let me pass along a question that's probably on a lot of people's minds, mine included, and that is, does the stock market response so far seem rational to you? In other words, it made sense to a lot of us that it crashed. That it's come back as much as it has. Is there some cognitive dissonance going on here? What's happened? How do you explain the stock market's response?
Stock markets, number one, remember, aren't about profits today. They're about profits over many, many years. So that's part of it. Part of it is what else are you going to do?
What do you mean, Bob? What do you mean? What else are you going to do?
Well, if you're in the market, what are you going to do? Are you going to pull everything out? I mean, we found time and time again that people who do that are the ones who lost their shirts. So that lesson has been driven home over and over and over again. We have an aging population in the United States, which is dependent on the growth of that. So they didn't pull out as much as they did last time. So is the market overvalued, in my opinion? There are a lot of markers which show that it is overvalued right now. But the one thing I know is the market doesn't move on economic fundamentals alone. They move on belief structures, on expectations, and pieces that I don't see when I'm putting in the fundamentals.
Yeah, the question was almost, are the markets efficient? And I don't know. I mean, I was chatting with my students the second half of the semester. I mean, we'd be talking a lot online about, what's happened to the stock market and why is it going up? Why is it going down? And a lot of it was, I don't even try to understand what the market is doing because I can't. And I don't personally play around with my, I have my money, my retirement account, and it's there, and I don't touch it because I don't think that I'm going to be able to figure out what the market's going to do. So there's been some weird changes. It was surprising to me, for example, that it took so long for the stock market to actually start to drop initially. I mean, it was all the way almost till the end of February before we even saw any sort of downturn. And it was clear that there were problems happening across the supply chain in China. And then we had the dramatic collapses, and now we're back up 30% from their lows. And, it was up today because, there was the chance there might be an retroviral, antiviral drug that's going to work. And so if that doesn't work, will it drop again? And so I don't know. The stock markets are weird. That's all I'm going to say. So,
but what it shows to me is it's another indication, and I have several indications, but it's an indication of the optimism of where businesses and individuals are right now. All right. The fact that the market went up the way it did is an indicator that they're more optimistic about what's going to happen over the course of the next year than Dan is projecting with where he is. Now, it doesn't mean they're right, but it means that they're more optimistic about that. And so from my perspective, as I try and model what will happen to the economy, if you start thinking that people are a little bit more optimistic than they should be, or that they're more optimistic than you think they should be, because what's the correct level of optimism, then there's a potential for an economy to grow a little bit faster than your expectation. Because they're going to take investment decisions, they're going to spend money that you wouldn't expect them to spend. So the market's not a good measure of where the economy is going to go. I know that we use it in things like the index of leading economic indicators, but it's not a very good short-term measure of where things are going to go. It does a little bit better when you start looking out over a 5 or 10 year horizon.
And so, Paul, you do have your pulse on the regional economy, your finger on the pulse of the regional economy. Are you hearing optimism? Are people staring this down and saying, yeah, once we get therapeutic drugs or a vaccine, or even if we don't, we're going to start staggering an opening and things are going to be all right?
Well, I think we've moved, it's almost like we're moving through the stages of grief as we look at this. So as we hit the end of March, what we saw was just shock, and people were in shock. And we saw a big drop in things like consumption at restaurants and things like that. Okay, so near the beginning of the month, 30% of restaurants closed. The amount of food purchased at the restaurants that were left open had dropped by 60 to 70%. As the month went along, not a lot more restaurants closed, but the amount that they were down compared to the year before continued to go better. All right, so they're now about 35% of what they would have been selling normally. This is all an indication right now that there is a little bit of optimism. The U of M sentiment survey, which went from nearly 100 in February to 70 in April, they gave a nice note in late April where they talked about what was driving that sentiment. And what was very interesting was that it was a very small, it was a minority that talked about finances. The vast majority were worried about getting sick with coronavirus. Okay, so this tells me right now that what we have is a lot of uncertainty, and it's all being driven by the virus, and that people haven't caught up with worrying about the economics yet. I know that's changing, and the reason I know that's changing is if you look at the story count in news organizations in the first part of April, every story was talking to doctors and nurses and healthcare providers. If you start looking at it here at the end of the month, you start seeing a lot more economists and finance people. You know, at the beginning of the month, I talked to maybe one news outlet. You know, in the last week, I've talked to 10. The difference in that is that people's mind shift is starting to shift right now. And there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to play out. And the short answer is no economist can tell you how it's going to play out. Because number one, we've never seen the economy stop that quickly. And number two, it's about the virus. So we have to be watching those two things. But we can't I can't point to 5 markers that I always use to see where the economy is going, because they're worthless at this moment in time.
Okay.
And that uncertainty is what's going to slow us
down. Let me conflate 2 of the questions here that follow up on that some, and that is, do you think that we're getting credible information from the sources that we have, and what sources of news and information do the 2 of you personally consume on a daily basis? The caller is asking, you know, I'm looking for alternatives to the basic mainstream information, or if you want to defend those as credible, should we stick with those? What are you consuming by way of media, and do you think they're fairly representing what's happening?
I'll let Dan go first.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. To be honest, yes. I mean, you look at, you know, you would look at the government sources, you'd look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you would look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, you would look at the Federal Reserve website. And so that's BLS.gov, BEA.gov, and FederalReserve.gov. Those would be places to get primary sources of data if you're looking for those. And those are trustworthy. In terms of like media outlets, I do trust a lot of the mainstream outlets. If I'm looking for economics, you know, the Financial Times is really good. The Wall Street Journal is really good. I often don't look at the op-ed pieces in the places, but I look at the articles. The Economist is pretty good, but I think you have to look at it. You can't just look to one source. You have to look at a bunch of different places. So I spend a lot of time on Google News and read articles from a bunch of different places. I actually have spent a fair bit of time, seemingly strange, but on Twitter. There's actually some really good economists on Twitter from sort of across the right to left spectrum who get into interesting debates. You can follow these debates, you know, sort of live, and you can even interject themselves. And that's actually been a really interesting way for me to get information too, is to follow a bunch of people talking these sort of open conversations. And there's a lot of garbage, of course, on Twitter and social media, but I've actually found some pretty good information there as well.
Thanks.
I mean, I do much the same thing. One of the things that we have has exploded. We use a term like exploded. You know, I go to the actual data. So in some cases, you'll see the number of positives go up, but the number of people in ICU and on ventilators going down. So what does that mean? And so we spend time actually looking at that data and playing around with it. I like the Wall Street Journal. I like the New York Times. I like Bloomberg as far as major player sources go. The editorial in the Wall Street Journal is a little bit right. The editorial in the New York Times is a little bit left. But their major reporting is pretty good. And Bloomberg, and a lot of the biases, is just so focused on business that of people who are trying to influence us as to what our belief structure should be. And what that gives me then is often where to go look for other sources of data. The reporters will come up with some great ideas. It's like, I hadn't thought about that. And so you can then say, well, I'm going to go read that data. And that's what we do. We go and read that data. So I think one of the keys is that you have to find some experts that do that and report it in a way that isn't designed to influence you, but to give you information. And it doesn't mean that they can't have a personal opinion. I have personal opinions, and so does everybody else. But when I'm reporting the data, I'm reporting it the way I see it, given my professional background. And the fact that I do that in a consistent manner, the fact that Dan does that in a consistent manner, the fact that you do that in a consistent manner, means that those people digesting what I'm telling them can interpret that. I think that's really important. One of the things that we've gotten past is finding in experts and trusting those experts in what they do. I don't try to be an epidemiologist. I'm not one. All right. I go and I take the best information that they have, and I use it as an economist. But I'm not going to be doing epidemiological studies. I can barely pronounce it. So what we're finding right now is that people believe that by going on Google and looking at lighter duty stuff or reading an article on something makes them an expert. And for us to talk about where an economy is moving, I don't know what Dan does, but I spend probably 2 hours a day just reading economic stuff. That's what I do every single day. I do it for fun. I enjoy doing it. And because I have that amount of background information, it gives me the ability to talk about things. That's what experts do. And I think that that's important. It's something the United States has to get back to, is trusting some experts. You don't need to trust me, but find one.
I was going to ask a question that I think you anticipated and answered, and maybe you're admonishing those of us in higher education too, that to reestablish trust in us as well, that helping people understand what expertise is and then demonstrating it ourselves with a little bit of humility will go some ways, because we're going to have a generation of students coming in now who've gone through this. And as you said, there's a lot of uncertainty. The models don't help. What don't we know? And maybe being honest about that as well. Mm-hmm. We have reached the limits of our time. I just want to thank you both. Dan, you want a last word?
Yeah, well, I just want to say one thing too. I mean, and one of the things we also do is, like in my neighborhood, I've got, the person who lives across the street from me, he is in construction. He runs his own construction firm, and he's been shut down. And there's a lot of people that you're out, and that these are real individuals who are hurting, who are being affected by this. And so while we're reading, and Paul's the same, while we're reading all this stuff, we know that there are real individuals who are being affected by everything that's going on. And so knowing that you can combine these two things and saying, if we're going to do this, there are going to be some real world consequences that could really affect people, sometimes in positive ways, but also sometimes in negative ways. I think that's something really important that we need to keep in mind too.
I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who joined us. Please feel free to contact us via email with further questions. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in May. My guest will be Fred Keller, the founder of Cascade Engineering, and a thought leader who's going to talk about reimagining capitalism in the 21st century. Thanks very much.